Thanks, Joko. We're joined now from Manchester by the Shadow Business Secretary, Chuka Umunna. Mr. Umunna, welcome to the programme. You're clearly trying to recover.
Good to be with you.
You're clearly trying to recover the people's trust when it comes to deficit reduction, debt, and balancing the books. Why do you think you lost that trust in the first place?
Well, I think we've been winning back support throughout our time in opposition, and ultimately people talk about polls, but if you look at all the local elections we've had, we're putting on more councillors, importantly in the marginal seats where we need to win back support.
Yeah, but why did you lose the trust?
Obviously there was a global...
Why did you lose the trust on deficit reduction?
If you let me finish, clearly there was a global financial crisis that happened while we were in office, which started off in the banking sector. That caused a recession, which then in turn caused tax receipts, both corporation and income tax receipts, to fall. Now, we've said we, of course, should have better regulated the banks during our time in office. But the important thing, and Ed was just saying this in the Q&A following his speech just now, is whether or not you have learnt the mistakes. And of course, we've learnt from those mistakes and said that we should have better regulated the banking sector, and we need the banking sector to do a better job for the real economy, like, for example, ensuring that our small and medium-sized businesses can get access to the finance that they need to expand and grow, which is so important given that they create 2/3 of private sector jobs.
And you don't think you lost the people's trust because you continued to borrow too much in the good years?
No, look, I don't think that because we invested in your viewers' schools, hospitals and in people was the reason that Lehman went under in the US and over here.
But you did so with borrowed money. You carried on borrowing after 10 years of growth. Should you still have been borrowing 40% of GDP after 10 years of growth? Why did you? Is it not the fact you continue to borrow so much is one reason why people don't trust you now?
The reason that the debt and the deficit increased after the global financial crash is because we saw a fall in tax receipts. That's principally why we had the debt and deficit issues that we had.
But my figure was for before the financial crisis, Mr. Umunna. My figure was
people's
before
wages stagnated, so they weren't paying as much income tax.
Yes, but the figure I gave you was before the financial. It went up to over 70% after the financial crisis, and I perfectly understand that was because of the financial crisis. But it may be that people don't trust you because you continued to borrow even during the good times.
I don't accept that the reason that we had the big debt and deficit issues that flowed from that crash is because we were borrowing too much beforehand. But look, the important thing is, and your viewers are in the future business, is whether or not in our offer to the people, our contract with the people today in the manifesto, which seeks to ensure that people can meet their aspirations and dreams, but also we care for the vulnerable and those who can't provide for themselves, and also that we do that in a responsible way and balance the books. What people want to know is whether the commitments in our contract with the people published today, whether they are properly funded and responsible. And in each and every single case, they are. Now you can compare and contrast that to George Osborne, who was on your sister show, the MAR programme yesterday, who was asked over 18 times how he was going to fund, for example, his income tax commitments, their commitments to put this £7.5 to £8 billion into the NHS, and no answers were forthcoming. That is very different
we've already
to what
run
you're seeing
that.
from the Labour Party today.
When we get the Tories on, we'll speak to the Tories about their policy. I'd like to stick with your policy. You say you're going to balance the books, but of course that's not entirely true, is it? You're only going to balance part of the books. It is perfectly possible that at the end of the next Parliament, you will still be borrowing money. You will still be running a deficit. So why should we trust you?
Well, we've been clear, as we've set out in the manifesto today, we're aiming to get a surplus on the current budget by the end of the next Parliament. We are aiming to see the deficit fall year on year. And just to be absolutely clear, in our manifesto, there are no commitments, including on capital.
No, you've said that. I'm not talking about your
additional borrowing, and that's the important thing.
No, but you've said that 3 times. I'm not asking you about that. What I'm asking you is, why should we trust you when it is still possible under your plans that the overall deficit by 2020 could still be a budget deficit?
We have set out more detail in respect to the debt and deficit position than any other opposition I can remember.
So do you accept that there could still be a deficit by 2020?
We're aiming to balance the books and get a
No,
current
you're not.
budget
Excuse me, Mr.
surplus
Umunna.
by
You
the
are
end of this
not
Parliament.
aiming to balance the books. You're aiming to balance the current budget. You're still prepared to borrow for the capital budget, which is around 30
But
billion
I've
a
just
year.
said to you, Andrew, I've just said to you that in our manifesto there are no commitments, including on capital, that entail additional borrowing. And I can't be clearer than that.
Well,
frankly.
let me just run you what Lucy Powell said to us on the Sunday Politics just a couple of weeks ago. Let's just take a look at this. To bridge the deficit, you will have to borrow more. You're going to borrow 30 billion a year simply to pay for public investment. That's part of what you're going to do, correct?
We're going to balance the books by the current expenditure by the end of the Parliament.
And borrow 30 billion a year for public investment.
We may use some investment borrowing for much needed investment, but not for day-to-day
No, I understand. So there you have it. You could still be, you may have balanced the current budget, but you will still be borrowing for capital investment. In other words, you could still be adding to our national debt in 5 years' time.
We are not aiming to do that. We are not aiming to
what did Lucy Powell mean
any
then?
commitments in this manifesto. We're not aiming. Well, look, if you run a current budget surplus that enables you to spend a bit more on capital, but none of these commitments that we're making in our manifesto today entail additional borrowing. And also, can I just add a very important addition to this, which is, and I heard the exchange that you just had with the IFS. Of course, the way you reduce your debt and deficit isn't just about what you cut, it's also what people are earning, which is why we're committed to getting the minimum wage to over £8 this coming Parliament and to incentivise more employers to pay a living wage, because if your viewers are earning more money, not only is that good for them, of course, but they're paying more income tax and national insurance. And also we're going to ask the top 1%, and, you know, good luck to them if they're doing really well, but we're going to ask them to make a bit of a bigger contribution to help us reduce the deficit. And I accept, look, Andrew, that, you know, one of the arguments that we're all going to face during this general election is, well, you're all the same. Well, in the last respect, particularly in terms of asking the top 1% of earners to make a bigger contribution, you haven't seen anything from, in particular, the Conservative Party on how they're going to do that. So there's three parts to this.
I don't want to go down that road. Both the IFS and HMRC say it's possible you won't get anything by any extra money by the 50p. But let me ask you this.
Well, we don't accept that, obviously.
I know you don't accept it, but, you know, people may listen to HMRC and IFS rather than you. But that's for the people to decide. Let me ask you this. You say you're going to reduce the national debt, but you're not actually going to reduce it in absolute terms. You hope to reduce it as a percentage of our GDP. But if you balance the current budget but continue to borrow up to 30 billion a year, you will add to the national debt every year. The national debt as an absolute figure could still be rising at the end of 5 years of Labour government, correct?
Our aim is to reduce the deficit year on year.
As a percentage of GDP.
Debt falling as a percentage of GDP.
But not in absolute terms. The debt will still rise.
In terms of debt.
But the debt will still be rising.
Look, what you're trying to get me to say to you is that we're going to borrow lots more money. And
no, I'm trying to get you to answer my questions.
That is not what we... Well, I know what you're trying to get me to say, which is that we're going to borrow lots, and we are not seeking to do that. We are going to get debt falling as a percentage of GDP by the end of this Parliament. I'll say again, no commitments in this manifesto that entail any additional borrowing. And ultimately, if you want to sort out the public finances, you've got to make sure that people are earning more.
Mr.
And that's
Umunna,
why we're going to get the minimum wage up beyond £8.
You are
and
not,
ultimately, through an industrial strategy, grow those sectors which create more jobs.
Yeah, let me just put this point to you again, though, because it is not true for you to say you're going to cut the national debt. Not in absolute terms. You're only cutting it as a share of our overall economy. Why should we trust you when you can't even be that honest in a simple matter like that? You could still be adding to the overall national debt. It's 1.6 trillion at the moment. On your figures, if you continue to borrow 30 billion a year for investment, it could be over 1.7 trillion. You will have increased it.
But there are going to be no, and there are no commitments for investment that entail additional borrowing in our manifesto. And as I said, you've got to get people's wages up. It is reasonable to ask the top 1% of earners to pay a bit more. And of course, you have to make efficiencies.
When it comes to cuts, Jim Murphy, the I better tell you because you're not always not too up on the names of the Scottish Labour Party. Jim Murphy, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, he says there are no need for any further cuts after 2015-16. Is that true?
Well, I haven't seen the transcript of what Jim said.
Well, he said it on the BBC on Sunday. There is no need for any further cuts after 2015-16. You've signed up to the Tory cuts of 15-16. Is that true?
In terms of the UK budget, over the next Parliament, there will need to be cuts. And Ed Miliband was actually just asked that question in the Q&A following his speech.
So Jim Murphy's wrong?
We will have to make cuts. Well, look, I haven't seen the transcript of what Jim said.
Well, I just told you. He said, let me tell you again. He said there would be no need for any further cuts after 2015-16.
Well, I'm telling,
he's on the record, on videotape. Is he wrong?
Jim is the leader. Jim is the leader of the Scottish Labour Party.
No, I know that bit.
The leader of the UK. Really? The leader of the
You're
UK,
the one that's got problems with the Scottish names,
Mr.
Umunna.
Look, Andrew, I know you loved that exchange between you and me, and it's probably 1-0 or 5-0 to you on that one.
That's not the game. I'm just asking. Let me just ask you one more time.
No, don't start giving me your quiz questions.
Let me ask you one more time. When the leader of the Scottish Labour Party says there are no need for any further cuts, do you agree with him or don't you?
The leader of the Scottish Labour Party. The leader of the Scottish Labour Party will not be in charge of the UK budget. The leader of our country, the next Prime Minister, Ed Miliband, will be in charge of the UK budget, and he's just answered the question when that was put to him, will there be any cuts over the course of this Parliament, not just in the first financial year, but in the following financial years? And he was absolutely clear there will be a need for further consolidation and cuts throughout the rest of the Parliament.
All right, Chuka Umunna, thank you for joining us.